Good evening, dear travelers, and welcome back to Snug as a Bug. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey into the heart of ancient Rome, where legends were born and courage and fate intertwined to shape history. Tonight's journey will guide you through 3 timeless tales from the dawn of Rome. First, we will witness the Oath of Horatius, a story of brotherhood and sacrifice, where honor is tested on the battlefield. We will then hear about the Sacred Geese of Juno, whose watchful eyes saved a city from impending danger, reminding us all of the unexpected protectors that watch over us. Finally, we'll explore the rape of the Sabine women, a tale that speaks to the fragility of peace, the pain of loss, and ultimately the power of unity. Let these stories unfold as you drift into a place of deep relaxation. The legends will guide you to a place of peace, where the ancient world comes alive, inviting you to release the day and sink into tranquility. Before we begin our journey into these ancient Roman legends, let's take a moment to fully unwind and prepare ourselves for the story that awaits. Close your eyes and imagine that you are standing at the edge of a grand ancient city, Rome itself, in its earliest days. The sky above is a soft twilight, painted in hues of violet and gold as the last rays of sunlight fade beyond the hills. Before you, the city stretches out, bustling with life, the murmur of people, the flickering glow of torches, the scent of pine and earth hanging in the evening air. Ahead, the Tiber River glistens in the fading light, winding its way through the heart of the city. The scent of fresh water mingles with the fragrance of herbs from a nearby market stall. You feel a sense of calm wash over you, as though you have stepped back in time to a place where every stone and every whisper carries the weight of legends. As you walk further, the shadows grow longer and the warmth of the day gives way to the cool embrace of evening. The city slows and the world seems to hold its breath, as if waiting for the stories to unfold. You find a quiet spot by the riverbank beneath the shade of a tall cypress tree. The sounds of the city begin to fade. You are ready. Ready to hear the tales of courage, sacrifice, and the eternal spirit of Rome. The Oath of Horatius. Chapter 1. The Shadow of War. Once upon a time, in the nascent days of Rome, the city was little more than a burgeoning town built upon 7 hills, each crowned with its own wild history. Rome had begun its slow but steady climb to greatness, but it faced many rivals. Among them was the city of Alba Longa, an ancient city believed to have shared lineage with Rome itself. However, these 2 kindred cities did not bask in shared prosperity. Instead, they stood at the brink of war, each eager to prove its strength, each unwilling to be overshadowed by the other. The rivalry had festered over petty disputes and border skirmishes, threatening to turn into a full-fledged war. But war was a heavy burden, and the young city of Rome feared for its people. Its fields of barley and wheat swayed in the breeze, but those same winds carried whispers of Alba's military might. The elders convened with worried brows beneath the temple of Jupiter, debating strategies until their voices grew hoarse, knowing that war, though brave, would cost both cities dearly. And then a solution was proposed, a contest between champions, a battle of honor that would decide the fate of both cities. No armies, no rivers of blood on the green fields, but a simple, resolute contest of 3 against 3. This would be the fate maker. From Rome, the task fell upon 3 brothers, Publius, Marcus, and Lucius, the sons of Horatius. They were of noble blood, trained from birth to wield the gladius and shield, their muscles hardened by endless drills on the dusty grounds of Rome. The people knew these brothers as the Horatii. When they heard of the challenge, they stepped forward without hesitation, offering themselves to uphold the honor of Rome. From Alba Longa, too, came 3 brothers, the Horatii, fierce and skilled, ready to fight to secure their city's dominance. And so the stage was set, and destiny awaited. The duel would take place upon a wide field, set halfway between Rome and Alba Longa, a place where the land sloped gently down into the valley, where the gods themselves might sit among the clouds above to observe the bravery of mortals. Chapter 2. The Dawn of the Duel. The sun had barely crested over the hills, bathing the field in golden light, as the 2 sets of brothers stood opposite each other. The morning air was heavy with anticipation. People from both cities gathered at the edges of the field, a throng of hopeful faces, some etched with fear, others with quiet confidence. The Horatii stood together, their eyes fierce and unwavering. Their father, the aged Horatius, clasped each of their hands in turn. He was a man of stern expression, and yet his eyes betrayed a hint of something deeper, an emotion too raw for words. "Fight with honor, my sons," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. "Rome's fate rests upon your shoulders. Return with victory, or return not at all." Publius, the eldest, nodded, his jaw set in grim determination. "We shall fight, father, until our last breath," he replied.
Marcus placed a hand on Lucius's shoulder, his eyes softening for a moment. "Stay close, brother. Together, we will see this through." Lucius swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "For Rome," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that twisted in his gut. The brothers turned, forming a line as they approached the center of the field. Across from them stood the Horatii, 3 formidable figures whose armor gleamed as brightly as the Roman brothers. Their expressions mirrored that of the Horatii, focused, ready, resolute.
One of the Horatii, a tall man with a scar running across his cheek, stepped forward and called out, his voice carrying across the field, "Romans, today we settle this once and for all. May the gods favor the brave." Publius raised his sword in response. "May the gods bear witness to our courage. Let honor decide the victor."
The herald raised his arm, and silence fell over the field. Time seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment there was nothing but the rustle of wind through the tall grass and the distant chirping of birds. The herald's arm dropped, and with a loud cry, the duel began. Chapter 3. The Clash of Brothers.
The clash was swift and brutal. Swords met shields with deafening clangs, and the brothers fought as though the gods themselves had poured fire into their veins. The crowd gasped as the 2 groups of champions closed in, their swords arcing like flashes of lightning. The Horatii fought as one, 3 blades moving in harmony, each brother covering the other, their movements practiced and seamless. But the Horatii were no less skilled. They fought with the ferocity of men who knew that their city's survival hung in the balance. Marcus gritted his teeth as he parried a blow aimed at his head. "Stay together!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the din of clashing steel. Publius nodded, his eyes locked on his opponent. "Lucius, to your left!" he called out, seeing a Horatius attempting to flank his younger brother. Lucius spun just in time, his sword meeting the oncoming strike. He stumbled slightly, the force of the blow jarring his arm. "I see him!" he grunted, pushing back with all his strength. The battle raged on, with each strike, parry and lunge echoing across the valley. The morning sun climbed higher, its rays glinting off the polished armor of the combatants, casting long shadows on the ground. Sweat dripped from their brows, mixing with the dust of the field and the blood of their wounds. Each brother fought not only for Rome, but for the others beside him. It was Marcus, the middle Horatius, who fell first. A cry of anguish rose from the Roman crowd as he dropped to the ground, his shield clattering beside him. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the earth. "No!" Lucius screamed, his voice raw with grief.
For a moment, time seemed to slow. The sight of Marcus lying motionless on the ground struck Lucius like a physical blow, and he could feel his heart breaking. Publius, too, felt the weight of their brother's fall, but there was no time for sorrow, not yet. "Lucius, stay focused!" Publius shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We cannot fall here, Lucius!" His voice was a mixture of command and plea. His sword flashed, striking at the Horatii with renewed vigor.
Lucius, his heart pounding and his vision blurred with tears, nodded. "For Marcus! For Rome!" he cried, his voice breaking as he lunged forward. The Horatii, though battered, still stood, their faces twisted with determination. It seemed as though Alba Longa would claim victory. The remaining two Horatii pressed their attack, sensing weakness in the Roman line. They moved with precision, their swords finding gaps in the defenses of the Horatii. Lucius, the youngest of the Horatii, looked at his elder brother. Blood trickled from a wound on his forehead, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He met Publius's gaze, and in that moment a plan formed between them, a desperate gamble that might yet save Rome. Chapter 4. A desperate gambit. Lucius turned and ran, his feet pounding across the field. The crowd gasped. Was he fleeing? Was Rome's honor to be tarnished by cowardice? The Horatii, seeing their enemy retreat, gave chase. They were wounded, but their pride demanded they not let the Roman escape. One by one they pursued Lucius, their formation breaking as they ran. Publius watched, his heart pounding. He saw what his brother intended. Lucius was drawing them apart, separating them, weakening the strength they held in unity. Publius took a deep breath, steadying himself for what was to come. With a roar, Publius surged forward. The first of the Horatii had drawn too far ahead of his brothers. Publius met him with a powerful swing of his sword, and the man fell, his cry echoing across the field. Lucius glanced over his shoulder, seeing his brother's success. He turned sharply, facing the second Horatius who had lagged behind, weakened by his wounds. The man's eyes widened in surprise as Lucius charged at him, his sword raised. "Rome will not fall!" Lucius shouted, his voice filled with determination. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, his sword striking again and again until his foe lay motionless at his feet. The last of the Horatii, seeing his brothers fallen, hesitated. He was wounded, alone, and faced two Horatii who, though battered and bleeding, still stood. Fear flickered in his eyes, and he took an uncertain step backward. Publius and Lucius advanced together, their swords raised. Publius called out, his voice strong despite his exhaustion. "Yield now, and you may yet live. Continue, and we will show no mercy." The Horatius looked between them, his eyes filled with fear and defiance. He spat on the ground, his voice trembling. "I will not yield," he spat, raising his sword. "For Alba Longa!"
The final clash was brief. The last Horatius fell, and with him, Alba Longa's hopes for victory. Publius and Lucius stood victorious, their swords dripping with the blood of their enemies, their chests heaving with exertion. Chapter 5. The Oath Fulfilled. The field was silent. The people of Rome and Alba Longa stood in stunned silence, the weight of what had just occurred settling over them like a shroud. The Horatii had triumphed, but at great cost. Marcus lay dead, and both Publius and Lucius bore wounds that would scar them forever.
The brothers stood over their fallen foes, their chests heaving, their swords dripping with blood. Publius raised his sword high, his voice carrying across the field. "Rome is victorious. By our blood, we have fulfilled our oath." The crowd erupted in cheers, the people of Rome raising their voices in a roar of triumph. The people of Alba Longa, though defeated, bowed their heads in respect. The duel had been fought with honor, and the outcome was clear. The aged Horatius stepped forward, his eyes filled with both pride and sorrow. He embraced his sons, his hands trembling as he touched their blood-stained armor. "You have done well, my sons," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Rome will remember this day." Lucius looked up at his father, his eyes red-rimmed. "Marcus, he fought so bravely, father. He gave everything for Rome."
Horatius nodded, his face etched with grief. "He did, my son, and his name will live on in the hearts of our people. You must carry his memory with you, always."
Publius placed a hand on Lucius's shoulder. "We fought for Rome, and we fought for each other. Marcus's spirit will guide us, even now." The family stood there for a moment, the weight of their loss pressing heavily upon them. The people of Rome gathered around, offering their thanks, their praises, their tears. Mothers held their children close, telling them to remember the names of the Horatii, to remember the courage that had saved them from war. Chapter 6. The Price of Victory. The Horatii returned to Rome as heroes, their names on every tongue, their deeds immortalized in the hearts of the people. But the price of victory weighed heavily upon them. Marcus was gone, his laughter and strength now only a memory. Publius and Lucius carried their wounds, not just in their flesh, but in their souls. In the days that followed, Rome and Alba Longa came to terms. The cities, once rivals, began to forge a bond, a fragile peace born from the blood of the champions. The duel had spared them the horrors of war, and for that both cities were grateful. But for Publius and Lucius the victory was bittersweet. They had upheld their father's words, had fought with honor, had brought glory to Rome, but they had lost a brother, and no amount of glory could fill that void. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Publius and Lucius stood upon the hill overlooking the field where they had fought. The wind whispered through the grass, and for a moment they could almost hear Marcus's voice, laughing as he sparred with them in the training yard, his eyes bright with the joy of battle. Lucius broke the silence, his voice barely audible over the breeze. "I miss him, Publius. Every day I feel the emptiness he left behind." Publius nodded, his gaze distant. "I do too, Lucius. But Marcus would not want us to dwell in sorrow. He would want us to live, to honor his sacrifice by building the future he fought for." Lucius turned to face his brother, his eyes filled with determination. "Then we will live, Publius. We will make Rome strong, and we will carry Marcus with us in everything we do." Publius placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Rome is safe," he said quietly, "and Marcus's sacrifice will never be forgotten. We must live on, Lucius, for him and for the future of Rome."
Lucius nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. They had taken an oath, and they had fulfilled it. Now they would live on, carrying the memory of their brother with them, a beacon to guide them in the days to come. As the stars began to emerge, one by one, the brothers turned and made their way back to the city. The cheers of the crowd had long since faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the night. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together, for they were the Horatii, and their story was far from over. Chapter 7. Shadows and Echoes.
Days turned into weeks, and life in Rome began to settle back into a rhythm. The markets bustled with merchants selling their goods, children played in the streets, and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air. Yet for the Horatii family, the world had changed irrevocably. The absence of Marcus was a shadow that lingered, an echo that reverberated through the walls of their home. One night, Lucius found himself in the training yard, his fingers tracing the hilt of Marcus's sword. The moonlight cast a pale glow over the empty space, and Lucius could almost hear the sound of Marcus's laughter, his voice urging him to strike faster, to move with purpose. He closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him. "Practicing alone?" Publius's voice broke the silence, and Lucius turned to see his brother approaching, a faint smile on his lips. Lucius nodded. "I thought maybe if I practiced, I could feel closer to him. I could remember what it was like, fighting side by side." Publius stepped closer, placing a hand on Lucius's shoulder. "We will always carry him with us, Lucius. He lives on in our hearts, in our actions. He would want us to keep training, to keep fighting for Rome."
Lucius looked down at the sword, his grip tightening. "I know, but sometimes it feels like a dream, like he could walk through that door any moment and we'd be whole again."
Publius's eyes softened, and he pulled his brother into a tight embrace. "We are still whole, Lucius. Not in the same way, but we are. And we must live for him, for the future he wanted for Rome." Lucius nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. Together they began to train, their swords clashing in the moonlit yard, the echoes of their strikes a tribute to their fallen brother. Chapter 8. The Future of Rome. The fragile peace between Rome and Alba Longa held, and in the months that followed, the two cities began to work together. Trade routes were established, and the fields that had once been stained with blood now flourished with crops. The people of both cities began to see each other not as enemies, but as allies. Publius and Lucius were at the forefront of this new alliance, their presence a symbol of the unity forged through sacrifice. They travelled to Alba Longa, meeting with its leaders, speaking of the need for cooperation, for peace. The people listened, for they knew the price that had been paid to avoid war. One day, as they stood before the council of Alba Longa, Lucius spoke, his voice clear and strong. "We are not so different, you and I. We have both lost brothers, fathers, sons. We have both known the pain of sacrifice, but now we have the chance to build something greater, to ensure that our children do not have to know the same pain." The council members nodded, their expressions softening. the leader of Alba Longa, an elderly man with a face lined by years of hardship, rose to his feet. The courage of the Horatii is known to us all. Your brother's sacrifice will not be forgotten, and we will honor his memory by working towards a future of peace. Publius stepped forward, his heart swelling with hope. Together, we will make Rome and Alba Longa strong. Together, we will build a future where our people can thrive. Chapter 9. Legacy of the Horatii. The tale of the Horatii spread far and wide, reaching the ears of distant cities and lands. The courage of the three brothers, the sacrifice of Marcus, and the resolve of Publius and Lucius became a story that inspired many. Children played at being the Horatii, their wooden swords clashing as they reenacted the duel that had saved Rome. The story also reached the Senate, where the leaders of Rome spoke of the need to honor the fallen. A monument was erected in the heart of the city, a statue of the three brothers, their swords raised high, a symbol of the unity and courage that had saved their people. One day, as Publius and Lucius stood before the monument, a young boy approached them, his eyes wide with awe. "Are you the Horatii?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Publius knelt down, smiling at the boy. "We are, young one. And what is your name?" "My name is Marcus," the boy replied, his eyes shining. "I want to be brave like you." Lucius felt his heart swell with emotion, and he exchanged a glance with his brother. "Then be brave, Marcus," he said, his voice gentle. "Be kind, be strong, and always fight for what is right. That is what makes a true hero." The boy nodded, his face lighting up with determination. "I will, sir. I promise." As the boy ran off, Publius rose to his feet, his gaze lingering on the statue. "Our story is not over, Lucius. It will live on in the hearts of those who come after us. Marcus will never be forgotten." Lucius smiled, his heart at peace. "No, he won't. And neither will the oath we took, for Rome, for each other, for the future." As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow over the monument, the brothers stood side by side, their hearts filled with hope. The path ahead was still uncertain, but they knew they would face it together, for they were the Horatii, and their story was far from over. The Sacred Geese of Juno. Chapter 1. The Shadow of the Gauls. Rome had tasted victory many times, but now, in the twilight of her newfound glory, shadows loomed from the north. The Gauls, fierce warriors clad in wild furs and driven by ambition and hunger, had begun their march toward the city. Rumors spread like wildfire through Rome, whispers of their advance, striking fear into the hearts of her citizens. For these were not the kindred warriors of Alba Longa, nor were they rivals in honor. The Gauls were an unknown, terrifying force, a people driven by conquest and plunder. The city braced itself for the impending threat. The elders convened at the forum, their expressions grim. The Senate debated endlessly, searching for a way to avoid disaster. The people of Rome gathered what little they could, preparing to defend their homes, their children, their very way of life. The fear that hung over the city was palpable. Men, women, and children alike felt the dread creeping into their bones. The capital, Rome's heart, held the sacred temples where the gods watched over the city, and atop this hill was the temple of Juno. There in the moonlight resided her sacred geese. Unlike other birds, these were not for slaughter or sacrifice, for they were believed to be the messengers of the goddess herself, a symbol of vigilance and protection. The people had always cared for these geese, feeding them with reverence, for they were beloved by Juno. But the Gauls had come. With them came the fire and destruction that seemed destined to raze Rome to the ground. The people prayed in hushed voices, their eyes turned skyward, hoping that the gods would not forsake them in their time of need. They gathered around the temple, seeking solace in rituals and offerings, trusting that the goddess Juno would shield them from harm. Chapter 2. The siege begins. The Gauls reached the gates of Rome like a swarm of locusts, their numbers seeming endless. Led by Brennus, a fierce and cunning chieftain, the Gauls laid siege to the city, surrounding it on all sides. The people of Rome retreated to the Capitoline Hill, fortifying their position, determined to defend the sacred heart of their city. Days turned into weeks. The Gauls roamed the streets below, pillaging what they could find, their campfires lighting up the night like ominous stars scattered across the ground. The people on the Capitoline Hill could see them from above, their hearts heavy with fear and exhaustion. Food was scarce, water was rationed. The once bustling city was eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of smoke and despair. The Roman defenders kept vigilant watch, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of an attack. They knew that if the Gauls managed to take the Capitoline Hill, Rome would fall, and with it, everything they held dear. One night, as the moon hung high in the sky, Brennus gathered his warriors. The Gauls were growing impatient. They had not expected the Romans to hold out for so long, and their supplies were dwindling. Brennus knew that they needed to end this siege soon, or risk losing their advantage. He devised a plan, a stealthy attack under the cover of darkness, scaling the steep cliffs of the Capitoline Hill, where the Roman defences were weakest. The Gauls sharpened their weapons, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Brennus addressed his men, his voice low and commanding. "Tonight we take what is rightfully ours. The Romans have grown soft, hiding behind their walls. We will climb the cliffs, and when the dawn breaks, the capital will be ours." His warriors grunted in agreement, their spirits lifted by the prospect of victory. Chapter 3. The Silent Threat. The night was still, the only sounds the crackling of distant campfires and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The Roman defenders, weary from weeks of sleepless nights, struggled to keep their eyes open. The Gauls moved like shadows, their forms barely visible as they crept toward the cliffs, their movements silent and deliberate. Slowly they began to climb. The rocks were jagged and unforgiving, but the Gauls were relentless. Hand over hand, they pulled themselves upward, their eyes fixed on the top of the hill. Brennus led them, his heart pounding with anticipation. If they could reach the summit undetected, victory would be theirs. Above, the Roman guards were unaware of the danger that crept toward them. Their eyes were heavy, their minds dulled by exhaustion. The city seemed to hold its breath, the very air thick with tension. It was as if the gods themselves were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Brennus urged his warriors onward, his voice a barely audible whisper. "Quiet, men! We are almost there. Soon the glory of Rome will be ours to claim." His warriors obeyed, their hands and feet moving with practiced precision as they climbed higher. Chapter 4. The Call of the Geese. Suddenly a noise shattered the silence. A honk, loud and piercing, echoed through the night. Then another and another. The sacred geese of Juno, perched near the temple, had sensed the movement below. Their cries grew louder, more insistent, their wings flapping in agitation. The sound jolted the Roman defenders awake. They rushed to the edge of the hill, their eyes widening in shock as they saw the Gauls halfway up the cliffs, their forms barely visible in the moonlight. "To arms!" one of the guards shouted, his voice ringing out across the hilltop. "The Gauls are upon us!" The Romans sprang into action, their fear replaced by adrenaline. They grabbed their weapons, rushing to the edge of the hill to repel the attackers. Stones were hurled down at the Gauls, arrows loosed into the darkness. The Gauls, caught off guard, struggled to maintain their grip on the cliffs. Some lost their footing, their screams echoing as they fell into the darkness below. Brennus, his face twisted with rage, tried to rally his warriors, but it was too late. The element of surprise had been lost, and the Romans fought with a ferocity born of desperation. The Gauls were forced to retreat, their plan foiled by the cries of the sacred geese. The geese continued their calls, their honking echoing across the hilltop, almost as if they were celebrating their victory. The defenders of Rome stood tall, their spirits lifted by the realization that they had been saved by the goddesses' vigilant messengers. Chapter 5. The Gratitude of Rome. The dawn broke over the city, the first light of day casting a golden glow over the Capitoline hill. The people of Rome emerged from their shelters, their faces etched with exhaustion but also with hope. They had survived the night. The Gauls had been driven back, their attempt to take the hill thwarted. The sacred geese of Juno were hailed as heroes. The people gathered at the temple, offering thanks to the goddess and her vigilant birds. The priests of Juno led a procession, the geese waddling at the front, their heads held high as if they knew the role they had played in saving the city. "Let it be known," one of the priests declared, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "that the sacred geese of Juno have protected Rome this day. They are a symbol of the goddess's watchful eye, her love for this city and her people." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in a chorus of gratitude. The geese, oblivious to the praise, honked and flapped their wings, their cries echoing across the hilltop. Offerings were brought to the temple, grain, fruits, and garlands of flowers to honor the goddess and her sacred birds. The people believed that Juno herself had guided the geese, her divine hand ensuring the safety of the city. Among the gathered crowd was Marcus Manlius, the soldier who had first responded to the alarm raised by the geese. He stepped forward, bowing before the temple. "Juno, great protector of Rome, we thank you for your vigilance. Your sacred geese have saved us, and we will not forget this day." His voice was strong, and the people murmured their agreement. Chapter 6. The Weight of Leadership. Within the Senate, the mood was somber but resolute. The senators knew that while the attack had been repelled, the danger was far from over. The Gauls still surrounded the city, their campfires visible from the Capitoline hill. The food supply was dwindling, and the people were growing weaker with each passing day. Marcus Manlius, a former consul, and one of Rome's most respected leaders, had been among the first to respond to the geese's warning. He had fought at the edge of the hill, his sword cutting down the Gauls as they attempted to scale the cliffs. Now he stood before the Senate, his expression grim, We cannot rely on luck and the cries of geese to save us again, Manlius said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. We must find a way to end this siege, to drive the Gauls from our city once and for all. The senators murmured among themselves, their faces lined with worry. They knew Manlius was right. The people were growing desperate, their hope beginning to fade. They needed a plan, a way to turn the tide in their favor. After much debate, it was decided that envoys would be sent to negotiate with Brennus. They would offer the Gauls gold, a ransom, to buy their freedom and save the city from further destruction. It was a bitter decision, one that weighed heavily on the hearts of the senators, but they knew it was their only chance. Manlius spoke again, his voice filled with determination. We may pay them to leave, but let us never forget this shame. We will rebuild, and we will make Rome stronger. This city will never again be brought to the brink by invaders. His words resonated with the senators, and they nodded in agreement. They knew that once the Gauls were gone, they would need to fortify their defenses to ensure that Rome could stand against any future threats. Chapter 7. The Ransom of Rome. The envoys were sent under a flag of truce, their faces pale as they approached the Gaulish camp. Brennus, his eyes cold and calculating, listened as they offered the gold, his lips curling into a smile. He had known that the Romans would eventually break, that their pride would give way to desperation. He agreed to the ransom, but his demands were steep. The gold was to be weighed, and the scales used were tampered with, the weights heavier than they should have been. The Romans protested, their voices rising in anger, but Brennus merely laughed. "Vae victis," he declared, his voice dripping with contempt. "Woe to the vanquished!" The Romans had no choice but to comply. They watched in silence as the gold was weighed, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they were buying their freedom at such a high cost. The shame of it burned within them, but they knew it was the only way to save their people. As the Gauls packed up their camp, preparing to leave, Brennus approached the Roman envoys. "Remember this day, Romans," he said, his voice taunting. "You were spared because you were weak. Perhaps one day we shall meet again, and Rome will not be so fortunate." The Romans remained silent, their expressions hard. They knew they could not show weakness in front of Brennus. They watched as the Gauls marched away, their laughter echoing in the ears of the Romans as they disappeared into the distance. Chapter 8. A City Unbroken. The Gauls took their gold and left, their laughter echoing in the ears of the Romans as they marched away. The people of Rome watched them go, their faces a mixture of relief and anger. They had survived, but the cost had been great. The city lay in ruins, its people weary and broken. But Rome was not defeated. The people began to rebuild, their hands working tirelessly to restore what had been lost. The Capitoline Hill, the sacred heart of the city, became a symbol of their resilience. The Temple of Juno stood as a reminder of the night the geese had saved them, the goddess's watchful eye ever upon them. Marcus Manlius, hailed as a hero for his bravery, worked alongside the people, his presence a source of strength and inspiration. He knew that Rome had been brought low, but he also knew that they would rise again. The spirit of the city was unbroken, its people united in their determination to rebuild. One day, as the people worked to clear the rubble from the streets, Marcus Manlius stood atop the Capitoline Hill, looking down at the city below. He could see the men and women laboring, their faces etched with exhaustion, but also with hope. Children played among the ruins, their laughter a testament to the resilience of Rome's spirit. A young boy approached Manlius, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Sir, is it true?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Did the geese really save us?" Manlius knelt down, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, child," he said, his voice gentle. "The geese saved us, but it was not just their cries that saved Rome. It was the spirit of our people, the courage of the defenders, the unity of our families, and the watchful eyes of our goddess Juno. The geese were the sign we needed, but it was the heart of every Roman that ensured our survival." The boy's eyes shone with admiration. "One day, I'll be strong enough to protect Rome too." Manlius smiled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You will, young one. And remember, true strength lies not just in the sword, but in the will to stand when all seems lost. Rome has many protectors, not just soldiers, but people like you who love her and will work to see her flourish." The sun set over the city that day, casting its golden light on the people of Rome, who continued to labor among the ruins. The Capitoline Hill stood tall, a reminder of what they had endured and what they had yet to build. The Sacred Geese of Juno waddled around the temple, their honking a peaceful sound in the twilight. To the people of Rome, they were not just birds. They were symbols of hope, vigilance, and the divine favor that still rested upon the city. Rome had been tested, but she had not been broken. She stood proud, her people determined to rise again, stronger than ever before. The rape of the Sabine women. Chapter 1. The birth of a nation. Rome was still in its infancy, a city forged from ambition, hope, and sheer willpower. It was a fledgling state, founded by Romulus and built upon the 7 hills, where rugged men and adventurous souls gathered to carve out a future in the wilderness. The people of Rome were strong and resilient, but the fledgling city faced a dire problem. There were not enough women to ensure its survival. Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, saw the issue clearly. The city had attracted men from all walks of life, exiles, fugitives, and adventurers, but without families, without women to marry and bear children, Rome's future was uncertain. Romulus knew that if the city was to grow, they needed women, and they needed them soon. He convened his council, his brow furrowed, and his gaze resolute. "We have built a city that can stand against any foe," Romulus declared, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the gathering hall. "But our strength will mean nothing if we cannot build families. We must act, and we must act swiftly." The council listened, their faces somber. They knew the truth of Romulus's words, and they understood the weight of their situation. After much deliberation, Romulus devised a plan, a bold, risky plan that would ensure the future of Rome, but would come at a great moral cost. The neighboring Sabine people were known for their beauty and their strong family ties. They were a proud people, and their women were sought after for their grace and virtue. Romulus sent envoys to the Sabines, requesting alliances and marriages between their peoples, but the Sabines refused. They did not trust the Romans, viewing them as little more than brigands and upstarts. Romulus, undeterred, decided on a different course of action, one that would etch the name of Rome into history and forever tie the fates of the Romans and Sabines together. Chapter 2. The Grand Festival. Romulus announced a grand festival in honor of Neptune, the god of the sea. Invitations were sent to all the neighboring tribes, including the Sabines. The promise of feasting, games, and revelry drew people from far and wide. The Sabines, intrigued by the invitation and eager to see the new city of Rome, accepted. They arrived in great numbers, men, women, and children, all eager to witness the spectacle that the Romans had promised. The festival was a sight to behold. The streets of Rome were decorated with garlands of flowers, and the air was filled with the sound of music and laughter. The Romans had spared no expense in making the celebration a grand affair. There were chariot races, wrestling matches, and feats of strength, all held in honor of Neptune. The people of Rome mingled with their guests, their smiles hiding the true intentions that lay beneath. Romulus himself greeted Titus Tatius, the king of the Sabines, his demeanor warm and welcoming. "Welcome to Rome, noble Titus," Romulus said, clasping the Sabine leader's hand. "It is an honor to have you and your people here to celebrate with us." Titus Tatius nodded, his expression guarded. "The honor is ours, Romulus. Your city is impressive, and your hospitality is generous." The festival continued well into the day, the games and feasting delighting the crowds. The Sabines were charmed by the spectacle, their suspicions gradually easing as they enjoyed the hospitality of their Roman hosts. But beneath the surface a dark plan was in motion. Romulus had given the signal, a subtle nod to his men who were scattered throughout the crowd. The Roman warriors who had mingled with the Sabines suddenly sprang into action. They seized the Sabine women, pulling them away from their families and carrying them off. The joyous atmosphere of the festival turned to chaos in an instant. The cries of the women echoed through the streets, their fear and confusion palpable. Chapter 3. The Sabine Women Taken. The Sabine men, caught off guard, tried to fight back, but the Romans were prepared. They had the advantage of surprise, and they used it ruthlessly. The Sabine men were restrained, their weapons taken from them as they watched helplessly, while their daughters, sisters, and wives were dragged away. Romulus stood on a raised platform, his voice booming over the commotion. "People of Rome, we do this not out of malice, but out of necessity. We need wives, we need families, and we will treat these women with the respect and honor they deserve. They will be the mothers of Rome, the bearers of our future." The Sabine women, terrified and weeping, were taken into the homes of Roman men. The Romans tried to comfort them, offering them food, shelter, and promises of a future where they would be cherished and honored. But the women were inconsolable, their hearts filled with fear and sorrow for the families they had been torn from. One of the women, a young Sabine named Lavinia, struggled against her captor, her eyes filled with defiance. "How dare you take me from my family?" she cried, her voice trembling with rage. "I will never be yours, never!" Her captor, a Roman named Marcus, looked at her with a mixture of regret and determination. "I understand your anger, Lavinia," he said quietly, "but I swear to you, I will treat you with respect. I will protect you, and I will give you a home." Lavinia glared at him, her eyes flashing. "A home? This is no home. You have stolen me, and nothing you say will change that." Marcus sighed, his heart heavy. He knew that the path ahead would be difficult, that the trust of the Sabine women would not be easily won. But he also knew that he had no choice. Rome needed them, and he would do whatever it took to make her see that. Chapter 4. The Struggle for Acceptance. Days turned into weeks, and the Sabine women found themselves adjusting, albeit reluctantly, to their new lives in Rome. The Roman men, true to Romulus's word, treated them with care and respect, hoping to win their heart. They provided for them, spoke to them with kindness, and tried to ease their sorrow. But the wounds were deep. The women mourned for their lost families, their homes, and the lives they had known. They gathered together whenever they could, speaking in hushed tones of their longing to return to their people. Lavinia, who had become something of a leader among the women, often spoke of her determination to never forget who she was or where she came from. "We may be here now, but we are still Sabine," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "They may have taken us, but they will never take our spirit. We must stay strong, for our families, for each other." The other women nodded, their eyes filled with tears. They drew strength from each other, their bond unbroken despite the hardships they faced. The Roman men watched, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that their actions had caused such pain. They wanted to make amends, to prove that they were not the monsters the Sabines believed them to be. Marcus, who had taken Lavinia into his home, did everything he could to show her kindness. He brought her gifts, flowers he had picked from the fields, and food that he had prepared himself. He spoke to her of his hopes for the future, of his dreams for a Rome where they could all live in peace. "I know you hate me, Lavinia," Marcus said one evening as they sat in the small courtyard of his home. "But I want you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. I only want a family, a future. I want you to be happy here." Lavinia looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "You speak of happiness, Marcus, but how can I be happy when I was taken from everything I knew? My family, my people, they are lost to me."
Marcus nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I know, and I cannot change what has happened, but I hope that in time you might find a place here, that you might come to see Rome as your home too." Lavinia said nothing, her heart torn. She could see the sincerity in Marcus's eyes, and though she still felt the deep ache of loss, a part of her wanted to believe that perhaps one day she could find peace.
Chapter 5. The Sabines' Response. Back in the land of the Sabines, the news of the abduction spread like wildfire. Titus Tatius, the king of the Sabines, was furious. He gathered his warriors, their faces grim with determination. The Sabines would not let this insult go unanswered. They would march on Rome, and they would bring their daughters, sisters, and wives back home. The Sabine army was formidable, their warriors trained and disciplined. They marched toward Rome, their banners flying high, their hearts burning with the desire for vengeance. Titus Tatius led them, his face a mask of rage and sorrow. He had trusted Romulus, had believed in the possibility of peace, and now that trust had been shattered. When word of the approaching Sabine army reached Rome, the city was thrown into turmoil. The Romans prepared for battle, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they would be fighting the families of the women they had taken. Romulus stood before his people, his expression resolute. "We will not allow Rome to fall," he declared. "We took these women because we needed them, and we will protect them. We will fight for our city, for our future."
The Roman men took up their arms, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They knew that the coming battle would be unlike any they had faced before. They were not fighting a foreign enemy. They were fighting the fathers, brothers, and husbands of the women they had taken. Chapter 6. The battle begins.
The Sabine army reached the gates of Rome, their banners fluttering in the wind. Titus Tatius stood at the front, his eyes fixed on the city that had wronged his people. He raised his hand, and with a shout, the Sabines charged. The Romans met them at the gates, their swords clashing in a brutal and desperate battle. The air was filled with the sounds of battle, the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, the shouts of commanders rallying their men. The ground was soon stained with blood, and the once peaceful fields outside Rome became a battleground, the fate of the city hanging in the balance. Lavinia and the other Sabine women watched from the walls, their hearts filled with dread. They saw their fathers, their brothers, their people fighting against the Romans, and their hearts ached with the impossible choice they faced. They had begun to see the Romans not as monsters, but as people who cared for them, who wanted a future with them. And yet their loyalty to their own people could not be easily cast aside. As the battle raged on, Lavinia made a decision. She could not stand by and watch the people she cared about destroy each other. She turned to the other women, her eyes filled with determination. "We must stop this," she said, her voice steady. "If we do nothing, our fathers and husbands will die. And so will the men who have shown us kindness. We must act for the sake of both our peoples." The other women nodded, their faces pale but resolute. Together they descended from the walls, making their way to the battlefield. Lavinia's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the fighting men, her voice ringing out above the chaos. "Stop!" she cried, her voice carrying across the battlefield. "Stop this madness!" Chapter 7. The Intervention of the Women.
The fighting gradually ceased, the men on both sides lowering their weapons as they turned to see the Sabine women standing between them. Lavinia stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears as she looked at her father, Titus Tatius, and then at Marcus, who stood among the Roman warriors. "Father, please," she said, her voice breaking, "do not fight. We have come to care for these men, and they have treated us with kindness. We cannot bear to see you kill each other." Titus Tatius looked at his daughter, his expression softening. "Lavinia, they took you from us. How can you ask us to forgive them?" Lavinia shook her head, her tears falling freely. "They took us, yes, but they have also given us a home, a future. They are not our enemies, Father. They are our husbands, the fathers of our children. Please let there be peace." Marcus stepped forward, his sword lowered, his eyes meeting those of Titus Tatius. "We never meant to cause such pain," Marcus said, his voice earnest. "We wanted to build a future for Rome, but we see now that we have wronged you. All we ask is a chance to make things right, to live in peace."
Titus Tatius looked at the Romans, then at his warriors, their weapons still in hand but their expressions uncertain. He turned back to his daughter, seeing the tears in her eyes, and his heart ached. He had come to Rome for vengeance, but now he saw that his daughter's heart was torn between two worlds. After what seemed like an eternity, Titus Tatius raised his hand, signaling his warriors to lower their weapons. "If my daughter believes there can be peace, then I will not deny her," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But know this, Romans, we will be watching. If any harm comes to our women, we will return, and there will be no mercy." Romulus stepped forward, his expression one of gratitude. "You have my word, noble Titus," he said. "We will honor your daughters, and we will build a future together. Let this be the beginning of a new alliance between our peoples." The Sabine women moved among the warriors, embracing their fathers and brothers, their tears mingling with the relief of knowing that the fighting had ended. Lavinia turned to Marcus, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Perhaps there can be peace," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. Marcus nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "I will do everything in my power to make it so, Lavinia. For you, for our future. Chapter 8. A New Alliance. In the days that followed, the Sabines and Romans worked together to heal the wounds of the battle. The Sabine warriors were welcomed into Rome, their families reunited, and the city once again filled with the sounds of life and hope. The tension between the two peoples slowly began to ease, replaced by a tentative sense of unity. Romulus and Titus Tatius met frequently, discussing the future of their peoples and how they could work together to ensure peace. The two leaders, once adversaries, began to forge a bond of respect, understanding that their strength lay in unity rather than conflict. The Sabine women, who had once been taken by force, now found themselves at the heart of a new and united Rome. They were no longer captives, but bridges between two peoples, their courage and compassion paving the way for a brighter future. Lavinia, who had once vowed never to accept her fate, now found herself standing beside Marcus, her heart slowly opening to the possibility of love. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city, Lavinia and Marcus stood on the walls of Rome, looking out over the fields where they had once watched their people fight. Lavinia turned to Marcus, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "We have come so far," she said softly. "There is still much to heal, but perhaps one day we will truly be one people." Marcus took her hand, his gaze steady. "We will, Lavinia. Together we will build a Rome that is strong, not because of conquest, but because of unity. A Rome that honors all its people." Lavinia smiled, a small, hopeful smile. "For our children, for the future." And so the story of the Sabine women became a tale of resilience, of courage, and of the power of compassion. They had been taken by force, but they had transformed their fate into something greater. A bridge between two worlds, a foundation upon which Rome would be built. Their legacy would endure, a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the belief that even in the face of great hardship, there could be hope for a better future. Chapter 9. The Legacy of the Sabine Women. Years passed, and the unity between the Sabines and Romans grew stronger. The children born of these unions were a testament to the new alliance, a blend of Sabine grace and Roman strength. The city flourished, its population growing, its culture enriched by the blending of traditions and customs from both peoples. Lavinia and Marcus, once strangers bound by circumstance, had grown to love each other deeply. Their home was filled with laughter and warmth, their children a symbol of the future they had fought so hard to create. Lavinia often thought of her father, Titus Tatius, and the difficult choices he had made. She knew that without his willingness to listen, to set aside his anger, none of this would have been possible. Titus Tatius, too, found peace in the new Rome. He became a trusted advisor to Romulus, his wisdom and experience invaluable in guiding the young city. Though he had once marched on Rome with vengeance in his heart, he now worked to ensure that the bond between the Sabines and Romans would endure. The story of the Sabine women was told for generations, a reminder of the power of compassion and the importance of unity. The people of Rome honored their memory, celebrating the festival of Neptune each year, not only as a tribute to the god of the sea, but also as a commemoration of the day the Sabine women had changed the course of history. And so Rome grew, stronger, more united, and filled with hope for the future. The legacy of the Sabine women lived on in every child born, in every family formed, and in the enduring peace between the Sabines and Romans. Their courage had not only saved lives, but had also forged a new path for Rome, one that would lead to greatness. Lavinia stood with Marcus, their children playing at their feet, as they watched the city bustling with life. She felt a sense of pride, knowing that she had been part of something so much greater than herself. Rome was no longer just a city of exiles and adventurers. It was a home, a place where people from different worlds could come together and build a future. "Look at them," Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder as he watched their children. "They are the future of Rome, Lavinia. They are why we fought, why we endured." Lavinia nodded, her heart swelling with love and hope. "Yes, Marcus, and they will build a Rome that is even greater than what we can imagine, a Rome built on love, unity, and the strength of its people." And so the story of the rape of the Sabine women, though born of violence and sorrow, became a story of hope and resilience. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was the potential for light, for unity, and for a future where all people could live in peace. The Sabine women had been the heart of that change, their courage and compassion leaving an indelible mark on the history of Rome, a mark that would guide the city for generations to come. Now, dear listener, close your eyes, allow your body to sink deeper into the softness of your bed, and let the echoes of these tales fade into a gentle lullaby. Imagine the tranquil fields, the warmth of a setting sun, and the comforting presence of those you cherish around you. Good night, and sleep well.